Hello, Herbie. Nice to see you again. I think the last time we met in person was in an auspicious place in Delphi in Greece.
Yeah, quite amazing, wasn't it? I mean, extraordinary experience.
Yeah, really unique conference. So I don't think I've ever been at a gathering quite like that. So
Yeah.
really nice to catch up. A few tragic things have happened since then. Both
Yeah,
in the
they
world,
certainly have, yeah.
like the world's a different place. But I'm also remembering your friend, now I'm spacing on his name, the wonderful friend of yours who was
Kenny Young.
Kenny
Young,
Young.
yeah.
Yeah, he
He
passed
died,
on
yeah, a
since
few
then.
weeks ago, yeah.
I was really sad to hear that.
Yeah, he was an amazing guy. Yeah, he was a songwriter, and he was really committed to, all his energies went into trying to help with the help environment initiatives, and we started something called Artist Project Earth some 15 years ago to try and raise money from rock music and projects. So that was quite a success. But sadly, that's what we're going to continue. But obviously, his fundraising capacity is now no longer there, you know.
So that project was, you did cover versions of famous songs and then donated the proceeds from those albums.
Kenny wrote a famous song called Under the Boardwalk in the late 60s. And, still lived off the royalties from that song to quite an extent. But sort of 30 years ago, he decided to devote all his energies to produce rock music versions of songs by famous rock artists, and basically to use that music to raise money from environmental projects. First of all, we had something called the Earth Love Fund. Then 15 years ago, we started another one called Artist Project Earth. Yeah, so we funded between these two organizations, about 700 environmental projects around the world.
Wonderful.
So Kenny took rock songs by, Sting or U2 or Coldplay or, all these guys, and then added new backing tracks with Cuban or African music to them. And that was really remarkable stuff that he did. Kenny was an amazing, wonderful guy, yeah. So he died about 3 weeks ago.
Yeah, I know a little bit about that work through May East, who is part of the
she's the trustee as well, yeah. Sure.
But normally with these conversations that I call Voices of the Regeneration, I'm always really honored really to have elders like you join this series, because for me, I mean, you've been busy with this for what, 50 years?
45 years, something like that. Yeah,
You knew Schumacher. You were in all those early meetings.
But really, I mean, I started when I was a student at the London School of Economics, and I decided in the early 70s to study social anthropology, because I'd been living in Notting Hill Gate, surrounded by people from all over the world for many years, and I decided I need to know more about cultures that have continued for eons of time. And the people in Notting Hill obviously represented in some ways cultures from Africa, from India, from Bangladesh, from Sri Lanka, and so on and so forth. So I wanted to understand better, how people had been living for all these many millennia. And, so that was my entry point into trying to study social anthropology. And that really led me to then become an environmentalist, because it became clear that the cultures that these people came from were sustainable or indeed regenerative cultures, and basically could have continued indefinitely if it hadn't been for the interference by Western society. So that was really my entry point. And then in the mid-70s, I met Satish Kumar in London and wrote an article on the very first issue of Resurgence he ever edited in 1973 called The Radial House, which was basically designed for an ecological house, solar-powered house. So that was quite pioneering stuff, I suppose, in those days. And so from then on, I really worked in this field ever since. But the really interesting experience I subsequently had was I was working with John Seymour. Do you know the name John Seymour?
Yeah, of course. I actually, just before we got on, I dug out his self-sufficiency handbook. And but I thought that you co-authored a book with him, didn't you? But not the
Well, we did a TV series together. It's an amazing project. We approached the BBC to see whether they might be interested in a TV series on the history of human impact on the planet.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually we managed to get the budget together with co-productions from Germany and Austria and elsewhere. And it became a 7-hour TV series for BBC Two called Far From Paradise. And in that series, we basically traced the impact of mainly Western civilization on the environment, starting actually not just Western, but when we started in Iraq with, actually no, in Anatolia, the very first villages, agricultural villages, 12,000 years ago. Then we filmed in Ur in Iraq, one of the very earliest bigger cities in Mesopotamia, and the very impacts on the environment that came out of urban lifestyles at that time, basically causing desalination of farmland surrounding the old city of Ur.
I always find, sorry to interrupt briefly, but it fits very well here. I always find it quite telling that the oldest written record of humanity, the Epic of Gilgamesh, tells the story of downwind desertification. It basically says, do not cut down the trees, otherwise Mesopotamia will run dry. And we never learned the lesson.
Well, we quoted Gilgamesh, of course, in the program. Also, there are these clay tablets in which they recorded the annual yields of crops from the surrounding countryside, and gradually they went down and down and down. First the wheat yields went down, then the barley yields went down, and so on and so forth. And what was the reason for this? Well, it turned out to be salinization of soils, basically using water for irrigation that had some salt content and never flushing that sort of salt water out of the fields. So gradually salinizing the soils, feeding Ur, and as a result, causing that city ultimately to decline and ultimately die. It's a fascinating thing to look at in this series.
How would you, because I mean, you're really talking to kind of the beginning of the problem with us becoming agriculturalists and city dwellers. In terms of, like, for me, more and more, I'm realizing that while it seems like an oversimplification, if the old wisdom that seems to be common of all indigenous cultures, that we belong to the earth rather than the earth belongs to us, that we are patterned by the land and by life's processes, that we're quite literally expressions of it, and fundamentally dependent on the health of that process. That seems to be where we went wrong. But do you think it was directly linked to becoming farmers and city dwellers, or where did that come in?
Well, I mean, as you know, I mean, we were hunter-gatherers for hundreds of thousands of years, basically only harvesting from nature and always just taking what was available from nature. And then when agriculture first started, obviously it was the first stage of a major manipulation of nature, where basically say, okay, I have a bit of land here that I grow my crops in, and that's my land, and that is where I need to get my food from. But then there was a conceptual and systemic problem with basically you can't harvest from nature and not give back to it. I mean, or from a piece of land and not give back to it. So the question of how to keep that land productive and fertile became a major issue. Right early on, and certainly, the story of Ur and Uruk on other early towns in places like Mesopotamia are a demonstration of that. Certainly agriculture is also, of course, if you like, the fall from grace in some ways. Adam and Eve, if you take that story, they were basically hunter-gatherers. And once you get into agriculture, you have to start manipulating nature as never before. That causes all kinds of conflict between humans and nature, but also ultimately the jealousy of people seeing wealth accumulating from, the sort of intense utilization of nature and wanting some of that themselves, and the kind of tribal wars or wars between tribes who live in adjoining regions and see the wealth of a newly built city. So, the conflicts between humans and nature are directly related to the early stages of both agriculture and urbanization.
But it's interesting that what we now find out more and more is that what in that frame would be called pre-agricultural societies were actually practicing just a much more sophisticated form of farming or stewarding the landscape, being really keystone species in their interventions. Like, for example, what's pretty clear now is that most of the Colombian rainforest is a forest garden that evolved through human intervention and with human intervention, but humans as nature. So similarly, in so many other places, the North American Indian plains, the herds of buffalo, they weren't quite naturally the way that, well, I mean, it's precisely this false dualism of nature and culture that runs through even the way we talk about it. But in many ways, the North American ecosystem before, like pre-Columbian and pre-colonialization, was also a dynamic ecosystem in which human beings were, through fire stick burning and animal, like keeping wild herds of animals, were interfering. Where was that shift to that more primitive form of agriculture, with which then also came this idea of this is our land? Like, I sometimes wonder whether the ownership of land and that switch in perception of rather than belonging to the land is actually more fundamental than the agricultural start. What do you think?
Well, I mean, certainly, I mean, early agriculture was much more collective than modern agriculture. So, I mean, land typically was kind of not owned by individuals, but it was kind of utilized by tribes, and the tribes certainly, you know, particularly you're referring to North America or indeed South America. I mean, tribal agriculture is basically still involves give and take between humans and nature. I mean, the cultivation of crops depended very much on utilization of soils to assure that that could be done on a continual basis. I mean, in South America, it was particularly slash burn agriculture, where you remove a bit of forest and then burn the sticks and then use the ash for cultivating the crops. And then after a couple of years, the forest comes back and the trees regrow, and the fruit trees that you may have planted then become also harvested by the animals, by the monkeys, by the birds, and so on. And then you move on to the next piece of land. I spent a lot of time making documentaries in the Amazon in the late 80s. And so certainly I worked with a wonderful man called Darryl Posey and with the Kayapo in South America and Brazil. And he was one of the first people to document the point that you've just made, which was basically the Amazon rainforest was very much a place. It was not a natural forest in the strict sense of the word, but they were everywhere. You looked at islands of palm trees, for instance, which were always an indication that people have lived there. And there's also the traces of very well maintained, very rich farmland, you know, that has been found. There was a fascinating documentary made a few years ago by the BBC. As the forest is cleared by cattle ranchers and soybean growers, suddenly, you know, circles and squares emerged out of this cleared forest. And it was clear that that land had already been cleared on a much smaller scale, way, you know, in centuries ago. And they often left some very rich soils behind, what's called terra preta. Mm-hmm. It's kind of an indication of that they were very good at kind of manipulating the fertility of the land through putting back manure, but also fish bones and you know, other types of
biochar. They were actually
that biochar. Yeah, all of that was kind of, you know, it's recently been demonstrated. Yeah, this is a fascinating story. I mean, certainly the history of agriculture is very complex. It's not always just taking bits of land for a group of tribal people and excluding nature from it. There's even then, you know, there's often a give and take between humans and nature in forms of cultivation, where people are still partly hunter-gatherers and partly farmers.
And what in your life's journey, what began the focus on cities? I mean, I remember reading in 2001, 2002, when your Schumacher briefing on the work that you'd done on the ecological footprint of London.
Yeah.
You've been very involved with London. Weren't you also involved in setting up the carnival in Notting Hill?
Not setting up, but I moved to Notting Hill in 1964, coming from Germany. You know, having decided to study in London for a few terms at London University. But then I very quickly changed track and basically became a community activist in Notting Hill Gate. Had a stall in the Portobello Road and all sorts of crazy stuff going on at that time. And yes, I became involved in helping to run the Notting Hill Carnival in the late 60s. And yeah, I mean, as I already briefly mentioned, you know, I encountered all these people from different parts of the world that were all living together very peacefully in that part of North London, West London. And so it occurred to me that we need to understand, you know, I became fascinated by understanding London as a huge organism, because London was the first modern city of 1 million people plus from the 18th century onwards, and then grew into a city of 8.5 million people by the start of the Second World War. So it was a unique example of urban growth of a kind that had never occurred before in human history. And I tried to understand how that growth might have occurred. Obviously, the direct linkages between the development of steam technology and you know, London as a center of a global empire, all this kind of stuff. But then I started to kind of see, you know, where all over the world, cities were in one way or another copying that sort of growth. And by the time, you know, by the early 70s, there were dozens of cities across the world already of a similar size. So I began to think, well, what is the impact of that urbanization on the natural world? And at that time, I started to think about what people later started to call the ecological footprint of a big city like London. Where does the food come from? Where does the timber come from? Where does the water come from? Where all the resources that people take for granted and never really think about in their daily way of life. Then I read a brief essay by an American guy called Wallman, who had written about the metabolism of cities, or come up with that concept some years before. And I thought, would it be interesting to try and quantify the resources that flow into London and quantify the amounts of waste coming out the other end. And then from that also quantify the actual land areas that are required to keep London going. And that was kind of, I suppose, fairly pioneering work at the time. This was 85, I think it was. No, sorry, 1995. And then I started.
Sorry, was this, that was actually pre-Mathis Wackernagel and the official kind of methodology? Ah, okay.
Well, I wrote an essay called Metabolism of Cities in 89, I think it was. And this beginning to look at the contrast between the way nature works as a circular system. Basically, nature cannot exist and continue to exist without continuously refertilizing itself, as it were. I mean, if you go into forest in the autumn and see the leaves fall, you know that this is the basis for next year's growth. Whereas if you go into a city, you never take that into account. Basically, you take resources and never mind what happens to the waste. So I started to conceptualize or differentiate between linear and circular systems in this essay I wrote in 89, I think it was. And that partly, I have to say, came out of the work we did on this TV series, Far From Paradise. Mm-hmm. Just another example of what we looked at in that series was the impact of Rome on North Africa. I don't know that story. For about 500 years, Rome, also at that time a city of about 1 million people, kept, supplied the bulk of its food from North Africa, which had been tamed tamed, if you like, by Julius Caesar and other Roman generals. And basically, they turned a forest landscape similar to what you can still find in places like Kenya today, acacia forests full of animals, zebras, lions, tigers, elephants, lions, and basically, cut down the forest, created up many of the animals and put them up against the gladiators in Rome and elsewhere, and then turned the land into farmland. So for about 500 years, they got about 500,000 tons of grain from North Africa. That went into the stomachs of Romans. Then the sewage ended up in the Mediterranean. Fertility was never returned to the land of North Africa.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there was a permanent legacy of the lifestyles of Romans in this linear fashion, taking resources without returning the waste back to the land. So that was kind of, if you like, a prototype of what I then saw in London 2,000 years later, if you like.
Briefly, I always remember this, that when I was 14 years old, my father, who had a real passion for deserts,
All right.
it took me to southern Algeria. We drove through Tunisia into Algeria, and then down to Tamanrasset and through the Atlas Mountain, not the Atlas Mountains, the Hogar Mountains, over to a region called the Tassili Plateau near Janet,
right.
which is the southeastern corner of Algeria. And in there, in this plateau, there are lots of canyons, and in the canyons are you can find beautiful cave
oases.
And oases and cave paintings. And the cave paintings, which struck me after driving with my father 2,000 kilometers through the desert, including a place called the Garden of Satan, which is one of the hottest places in the Sahara.
Right.
And then arriving in a place where the cave paintings depicted crocodiles, giraffes, lions, and hippos.
Okay.
And in every direction, it was 2,500 kilometers of desert. And so it's just another example how the Romans continued a process that at points in prehistory, most of North Africa was very much like sub-Saharan Africa in terms of
exactly. Yes, I mean similar forest cover and similar fauna as well. Yes. So the Romans created up all these animals, and thousands and thousands of them ended up in the Colosseum and in other similar kind of arenas in the Roman Empire. Yeah, it's a shocking story. So I mean, in some ways, my interest in the metabolism of cities didn't just come from living in London at that, in the 60s, early 70s, but also from having been involved in this TV series, Far From Paradise for the BBC, and, documenting the impacts. Also, Plato wrote about the deforestation of Attica in his Critias dialogue, saying how that forest landscape on the outskirts of Athens, obviously 500 years before Rome, had also led to the deforestation and the permanent damage to the environment as a result of the demands for resources made by Athens on its surrounding countryside.
And they had pretty ruthless ecological war strategies. The way that the Romans, after they finally subdued Carthago, they actually salted the soils. They brought in salt and distributed salt on the fertile soils of Carthago in order to
really. But subsequently, they also used that as farmland for feeding the Romans as well. Yeah. Anyway, so certainly there's a difference in a world which is primarily agricultural and villages and small towns and the world that we live in today. I mean, as you know, we now live in a world where more than half the world's population live in cities, and we have over 20 mega cities of up to 20 million people. And so their consumption patterns now affects what we are doing to the planet as never before. I've just written an article for the Ecologist website on the linkages between deforestation in the Amazon and Chinese demand for meat. I don't know if you know that story. It's extraordinary, and as a result of the growth in wealth, and economic growth in China and urbanization, meat consumption in China has gone up from 7 kilos per person to 10 times that, about 70 kilos over the last 40 years. But at the same time, they've paved over a lot of their farmland through urbanization, through building motorways and all the rest of it. So now where do the animal feeds come from to feed Chinese population? Well, primarily from Mato Grosso and from the Amazon.
Yeah.
from Argentina and some of it from North America. But 80% of the soya beans now produced in the Amazon region go to feed pigs in China. You know, it's an extraordinary story. So that's another aspect of sort of ecological footprint of modern urbanization, you know.
I mean, you've spent at least the last 30 years researching city and seeing that evolution of these new megacities. I mean, basically, when you were starting this work on London, how many cities above 10 million people were there in China, and how many are there now? It's just mushroomed.
It's absolutely astonishing. I mean, it's an amazing story. And the interesting thing is, I mean, I filmed in China. We did another TV series in 1998, which was called People's Planet, and we filmed in Shanghai. And at that time, we could still see a lot of agriculture being conducted within the city itself, of small agricultural plots within the city region. And then the surrounding countryside was cultivated basically for the purpose of feeding Shanghai. About 300,000 hectares of land on the edge of Shanghai at that time still being used to provide vegetables and so on to Shanghai. But all of that is largely paved over now. And so when they are beginning to revive urban agriculture, particularly for vegetable crops, but when it comes to grains and animal feeds, they go long distance, they go global now.
And I mean, after all this research and practice, because I always remember, like when we were in Delphi, you shared the story of your work as thinker in residence in Melbourne, and how Melbourne,
Adelaide, yeah.
Adelaide in Australia. Are you still hopeful for cities to have a chance to be redesigned? Do you think that there are cities that are simply too big not to fail? And then the issue, because the early kind of Schumacherian take on back to the land and kind of 2 acres, 2 spades is also impossible with the amount of people we have at the moment. So where do you sit with this issue of that some of us will have to live in high density areas, and how do we make cities regenerative?
Well, you mentioned this example of Adelaide. So I was in 2003, after having done all this work and written a lot about this, problem, a systemic problem between urbanization and what we're doing to the planet, particularly to world's ecosystems. I got invited to be a thinker in residence in Adelaide, South Australia, by the Premier of South Australia. His name is Mike Rann. And he was a unique guy. He's no longer in that role, but he was a unique guy because he had been working for Greenpeace in New Zealand. And he was really, they had really internalized the issue of what we need to do to change the way we relate to the world's environment. So when he got the job as running South Australia, as Premier of South Australia, there was a problem at the time of the water supply to Adelaide, which is a city region of 1.2 million people, from the very sort of bit of a trickle of a river called the Murray River, which was drying up at the time. So they were getting really concerned, could that city region continue to exist? So then basically, out of this concern about water supply, they said, well, should we have a look at the whole system, how the city region works? So my job was basically to analyze Adelaide and South Australia, which is a population of 1.7 million people in total, from the point of view of sustainability. And so basically I did this for 10 weeks, endless numbers of seminars and working groups with people from all over the city region, and ultimately produced a report with 32 recommendations on renewable energy, on water efficiency, on wastewater recycling, on regeneration of organic waste in the form of compost, on some ideas of improving public transport and so on. And basically it was all implemented. The entire 32-point plan was implemented. So it's become, from a point of view of energy, for instance, it's over 60% of energy, electricity supply now comes from solar and wind. They built the world's largest battery in order to even out the fluctuations of renewable energy supply.
This is the work with Tesla, is it?
Yeah, the Tesla battery,
Yeah.
100% of the organic waste is now returned to local farmland. There's still a lot of agriculture on the edge of Adelaide and in South Australia. Water recycling, wastewater recycling used for irrigation purposes, and so forth. So I mean, it is an example of a city region that really has looked at itself and say, okay, we can do things differently. And in addition to being, really very sustainable in terms of its resource use, or indeed regenerative, because I mean, all these processes of recircularizing the metabolism of Adelaide goes beyond sustainability. And so certainly it is a very nice project to have been involved in, but I've never been able to replicate it. I've never had another opportunity to do something similar elsewhere, So I did a lot of work on London, and we had something called the Sustainable London Trust some years before that, and we kind of published reports about how London would think of itself as a place that could function very differently. Also made a documentary for Channel 4 on London's metabolism, where we looked at the inputs of resources into London, use of materials in London's economy, and then where do the waste end up. But that was just before Ken Livingstone became mayor of London. But again, I mean, there's a little bit of tweaking that has gone on. But by and large, cities like London are so preoccupied with their own wealth and their power as financial centers and as service economy centers and so on. So it's very hard to get cities that are so used to taking resources from the rest of the world, particularly in the case of London as the heart of the British Empire, and then saying, okay, this could function quite differently. So, I mean, I certainly haven't seen examples yet of other major city regions trying to do something similar. I was able to do with Mike Brown in Adelaide in South Australia.
Have you ever done any work with Puran Desai and Sue Riddleston and the bioregional?
I helped to get them going, actually. Bioregional, yes. I mean, he used to come to my lectures in London, and So.
But didn't they start a whole network of at least kind of suburb projects or some like parts of cities, looking at this one planet or
I know, yeah.
What do you
think?
Well,
it's an aspiration, basically, and I mean, we see the Beddington Zero Energy development, which they helped to get going, or is a wonderful example of what one can do in cities. But the architects who designed this, he's a very good friend of mine.
Bill Dunster. Bill Dunster.
Yeah. He's never been able to do something on a similar scale elsewhere either. So, there's good examples popping up from various places, mainly on a small scale. Sometimes, obviously, there's a lot of work going on eco-villages as well, but by and large, as you said earlier on, I mean, we have to find ways, if we are serious about living in an urbanizing world, we have to find ways of making these cities function very, very differently.
But how would you see that? Because on the one hand, of course, it's clear that we need to produce energy, food, water as close to home as possible in a way that actually regenerates that resource rather than depletes it. But that's easily said conceptually, and it's wonderful to we see a revival of urban farming in parks and in
all of that,
wherever. The same with some of the vertical farming might offer a little bit of additional food production in cities, but of course it's always going to be a balance in this, like re-regionalizing to what extent, or re-localizing at the city scale to what extent. And what's your sense, how if we made that decision of trying to close the loops as close to home as possible, what percentage of the main consumptive cycles could we actually relocalize? 50%, 70%, or
Well, you have to differentiate between various crops. I mean, I think you can do a lot with vegetables and fruit crops. And obviously that, you know, there's been a movement in that direction for a long time. I mean, there's a vigorous global campaign on urban agriculture, and particularly, of course, with poorer cities where food supply is a serious issue, where waste pollution, or particularly of organic waste, is a problem where people say, okay, why don't we use the sewage, the feces, the animal waste for localized food production systems. So we're seeing a lot of that happen in different parts of the world. I had a great time in Havana, Cuba, some years ago, where they did that very effectively. Partly out of necessity, of course, but that's another long story. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot happening with urban agriculture when it comes to vegetables and some fruit production. And as you said, there's quite a lot happening now with vertical farming and so on. But when it comes to grains, you see, it's a different story altogether. I mean, when I did this study on London's ecological footprint, which at that time I quantified as being about 125 times London's surface area, roughly the productive land of the UK. You know, the fruit and vegetables are not a very large part of that. And in any case, at the moment, most of that comes from Spain, from an area in southern Spain, which is huge areas of greenhouses, probably know. But when it comes to grains and animal feeds, we're talking about really very large acreages, 50, 60 times the surface area of a given city. And that's where it's much harder to relocalize that. I mean, in the case of London, historically, when they abolished the corn laws in the mid-19th century, that was kind of moved towards getting more and more of the grain, particularly the wheat and barley for bread production, and also the animal feeds from North America, from Canada, and from other parts of the world. So, I mean, if you wanted to get serious about London supplying most of its grain again from the UK, you're talking about much of the surface area of the farmland in this country. And of course, London's only got 12% of the UK's population. So, you know, where does Bristol, where does Birmingham get its grain from? So you're still talking about territories else in different parts of the world, you know. But, I mean, obviously, there's a lot can be done if we are serious about changing the way we do things. But for the moment, you know, global trade and free trade is still the name of the game. Globalization has, you know, intensified that development more than ever in human history. So we are now, you know, global exchange is what we are doing in terms of food, in terms of all the other supplies. So we are obviously, with Britain going for Brexit, it may be interesting to see whether or not there might be some change in direction regarding food production. But by and large, we're talking still about, you know, the game of global supplies rather than relocalization.
But what I'm trying to get at is less the pattern that unfortunately is still prevalent, but more on the basis, because you've also done this work on regenerative cities with the World Future Council, and then published a book on regenerative cities. When was it? 2014,
yeah.
14. And you must have a sense of, if the political will was there, if even the business sector, like the private sector, would say, we're willing to restructure how we exist, even the size at which we exist, into different networks in order to refit the human presence on Earth and human impact on Earth to the biophysical boundaries, and create more equity in the process. Like let's assume we'd say, let's implement the donut in cities, like Kate Raworth is trying to do in Amsterdam now.
Yeah.
What's your sense, from having looked at the figures for so many years, what is actually possible? Because of course, like we can relocalize food production, but then there are all these other material streams where we are dependent on certain technologies that we probably would want to use in the future as well, maybe not as ubiquitously as we use them now if the resource limit is such. But how would you see that process, and also the link with cities with their region? Because if we're moving into the UN Decade for Ecosystems Restoration right now. Once we look at the impact of cities, which is vast on the planet, we also need to look at how to shift that around and make,
of course,
the demand of the cities the driver of regenerating and restoring the ecosystems around the city.
Well, I mean, obviously, in my Regenerative Cities book, I have about 20 case studies where in various ways people are trying to do that on a limited scale. I mean, I obviously, as you already referred to, I've got the case study of Adelaide in there, which is kind of probably the most remarkable turnaround that you can probably find anywhere. But by and large, there are smaller initiatives of various kinds underway now. But certainly, you know, the reality that the urbanization is the primary impact on the biosphere is not fully understood. I've been trying very hard to change that. People always point to economic system as the primary problem, but not the actual spatial demands for land surfaces and resources from elsewhere on the planet made by an urbanizing world. That concept is still not very dominant, I think, in the debate. I mean, there's a lot of discussion on the future of cities. There's any number of organizations that in one way or another try to deal with urban sustainability. But there's ICLAI, the International Council for Local Environment Initiatives, or the C40 initiative, which brings together some of the world's biggest cities, and half a dozen others. But by and large, the understanding that, you know, there's a conceptual systemic problem between an urbanizing world and the ever greater impacts on the global environment from the demand patterns of cities. Very difficult to bring that message home to thinkers. So, for instance, just one basic point is, I mean, when London grew in the 19th century so very rapidly, there was this huge problem about what to do with sewage. So the Thames was full of shit, basically. And they said, what can we do about this? And so they had various consultants come to advise London at that time. And so some people said, let's recycle this stuff, particularly a German guy called Liebig, Justus Liebig, said, let's recycle this stuff and put it back on the farmland and then keep farmland productive in that way, because you realize that you had to return all the nutrients contained in sewage back to farmland in order to keep it productive. Cut long story short, they went for a different approach, which basically to chuck all of it into the Thames estuary, not to return it to the land. So then Liebig said, okay, if we are not going to return the nutrients from London back to the farmland, we have to develop artificial fertilizers. So that there's a direct link between London's decision to go linear in terms of its resource use, particularly plant nutrient resource use, and you know, its decision to basically chuck the stuff in the Thames estuary instead. Whereas today we have all the world's cities basically doing the same thing. So when you look at the world's major rivers and the estuaries, particularly the large estuaries such as the Mississippi, for instance, so you have a large surplus of fertilizers from farmland and sewage.
Dead zones.
It is all ending up together, causing dead zones, huge dead zones in estuaries. So this is a huge conceptual problem. The same thing is happening with the Yellow River, with the Yangtze, with the Rhine. Situation is a little bit improved in recent years, but by and large, this conceptual problem and the relationship between cities, their use of farmland, their refusal to recycle the stuff, and then at the same time taking ever more farmland to feed, you know, an ever more meat-hungry population. So we are certainly, you know, it would be nice to be very positive and optimistic in this respect, but for the moment we are not seeing really serious change in direction in this crucial systemic context.
And are you, I mean, one of my great inspirations for thinking about cities and also thinking about systemic repatterning, particularly at the scale of the region, is Sir Patrick Geddes and the work that he did in
sure.
because he
Nice.
worked on so many levels. I mean,
he was great. He's got all these points were, you know, certainly in his thinking. Yes.
Well, not because he was, on the one hand, he was a thinker, but he was also a practitioner. The way that he, being professor at the University of Dundee, actually moved into the slums of Edinburgh around the castle, and then worked with the prostitutes and lowlifes to basically begin a process of gentrification. He invented the first student union to bring the students into that slum area, because he understood that when they were there, things would start.
Really? Okay, I didn't know that.
He invented the Edinburgh Festival by bringing Heckle and people like Kropotkin and all sorts of people to Scotland with a clear, because he had this experience when he traveled as a younger man in Bavaria and got served in a country restaurant or country inn. And he was surprised by the level of education of all the people working in that inn. And so he really started this conversation in Scotland that really led to a cultural blossoming of the region and a shift in the Scottish education system. Like even the Celtic revival, he was also involved in that, bringing the myth of the old Celtic legends back into connection with Scotland, and all of that mixed with the Art Deco time and like the Jugendstil time. Fascinating, man. And I
must read up more about him. I mean, I obviously read some of his work, but not recently. So I'm glad you're reminding me of that. Yeah. But I mean, certainly, I think your work on regenerative cultures, I think, is also where I'm heading strongly to, because it's clear that, you know, it's, you know, just looking at the sort of physical metabolism of cities is only one aspect of the story that we're talking about. I mean, it needs to be internalized deeply in the cultural context in which we live. And so I'm really very respectful of what you're doing in this context. I think I'm also with the Club of Rome and the World Future Council. We are very much focused on cultural change rather than just the physical changes that are needed to bring about the kind of reconciliation, if you like, between humanity and the global environment. So these are deeper issues beyond just the physical metabolism of cities.
Mm-hmm. Good that you mentioned the Club of Rome. I'm curious because you've been a member of it for quite some time, and even within the Club of Rome, it seems like there is a culture shift happening right now. From what I mean, I know a lot of people who are involved with the club, and there seems to be a slow shifting away from the legacy of a sort of limits to growth. Everything has to be computer modeled and very data driven and sort of hard science driven, to understanding the sociological, cultural dimension, the worldview dimension, the fact that you can't make people shift by telling them what to do, but by actually recreating, like creating enabling conditions that their behavior changes because of a shift in worldview and a shift in understanding.
Can I just stop you for a second?
Yeah.
He's coming.
Now it would be useful to know how to edit this out. There is a way of pausing the recording. Let's try that.
Sorry, yeah. So I mean, obviously the Club of Rome story is quite interesting in this overall context. Initially, from the 1970s onwards, with limits to growth. I mean, that was a fascinating study, you know, computer model of what the future is likely to hold. And certainly the collision course between humanity and the environment was starkly represented by that work and conceptualized and quantified for the first time in a remarkable way. So certainly the Club of Rome, if you like, for many years it lived off this sort of glory of that work, but also of the very controversial nature of it, because the world's futurists hated that there might be limits. And so, for instance, Herman Kahn in America who was at that time the leading futurist, he was one of the main opponents to the idea that there could be any limits to progress, to this sort of march of civilization and so on and so forth. So yeah, for many years there was lots of other reports written and about, particularly around this issue of limits. But then gradually, it became clear that one couldn't solely concern oneself with that particular perspective. So more recently, there's a kind of attempt to try to bring new dimensions into this work, and so certainly cultural change in the deeper sense is becoming much more important. But also, of course, rethinking economics. I've been heavily involved in work on reframing economics for the Club of Rome recently. And of course, you mentioned the donut concept of one of the members of the Club of Rome a moment ago. So yeah, there's a lot of thinking underway. I mean, it is, but I mean, we have a strange situation. The main author of the Club of Rome Limits to Growth report, Dennis Meadows, together with his wife, former wife, Donella, she's sadly no longer with us. Basically, Dennis is now saying, well, it's too late. We can no longer expect, a reconciliation ultimately between humanity and environment. The impacts, the pressures, the human numbers, the demand on resources. If you add it all up together, he cannot imagine a scenario where basically we can reverse this collision course that we are on. And so that's certainly obviously quite a depressing perspective. Mm. I'm not a depressive sort of guy, really. I always try to find solutions. So yes, I mean, we are working on consciousness change. What could a new civilization look like? We are working on, as I said, reframing economics, and particularly, of course, we are concerned and linking up with young people and these wonderful young campaigners who are saying, okay, we do not accept that we don't have a future, that we are going to have to pay for your sins, like Greta Thunberg and so many of our colleagues are now saying. So that's in some ways an incentive for the Club of Rome, but indeed also for the World Future Council, to say, okay, we can no longer accept this deeply depressing scenario that comes from the work of some of the forefathers of the Club of Rome. So we are trying very hard to kind of try and see whether or not we can come up with positive perspectives, but it's not easy these days. And I'm sure you're keenly aware of that yourself in your own work. I mean, we are really faced with very stark realities in the world. Human numbers multiplied by ever greater demand for resources through increasing living standards, particularly in developing countries or post-developing countries like China. Obviously, these are all factors that we are trying to have to get to grip with, and it's not easy to do so.
No, I mean, the fascinating situation is that the only place of hope is actually, to some extent, beyond the frame of a linear data analysis and modeling perspective of the situation. Like, it's all wonderfully useful to have these models, but in many ways we now have to do the impossible, because the likely and the probable based on scientific models is literally unthinkable and unconscionable. So we need to somehow work miracles in.
Yeah.
I think it's in the dual path of preparing for the rocky decades of the next 3-4 decades, in the holding the real possibility that it is too late and that we need to prepare for a very climate unstable and for many other reasons unstable world, but that the logical response to that would still be trying to heal the place in the region you're in, re-regionalizing production and consumption to create more redundancy and resilience, build climate resilience, build the capacity for people to cooperate and collaborate in the face of calamity as a direct goal of political policy, and which means re-regionalizing political process, subsidiarity. It means
all of that, yeah, sure.
Economic systems. But in that, I think, is also the potential pathway towards the regeneration of patterns that would then actually heal both social and ecological systems, to the point that I still believe it's possible to some extent turn back the tide of cataclysm, and actually regenerate ecosystems, because we have so many amazing examples of where that has been achieved.
Yeah. No, of course. I mean, you work with John Liu, I think, some of the time. Yeah. But he's an old mate of mine as well. So yeah, I mean, he's documented wonderful stuff that's going on in China, and the reforestation there in the Yellow River uplands and in Ethiopia and elsewhere. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of tree planting going on in Ethiopia. Yeah, certainly. I mean, there's wonderful initiatives on tree planting in many places now. But then you see the pictures of, the burning rainforest and the burning forests of Siberia and so on. So,
yeah,
we are busy in some places of the world, some parts of the world, to replace lost vegetation. But then in others, it's just going up in smoke. So yeah, I mean, I'm all for every possible initiative on regenerating ecosystems. Obviously, I mean, that's for me, the main, if you like, the gospel of the future. Regenerative activities of all kinds, regenerative energy. I mean, it's great what's happening with renewable energy. I mean, it's absolutely remarkable that we are now seeing more investment, total, annual capacity of in wind and solar than we are seeing in coal-fired power stations and even in gas-fired power stations. So all of that's great, but I mean, it's certainly difficult when you come to very large urban systems like 10, 20 million people to power those with renewable energy, to get them to be fully regenerative in terms of their food supply. So certainly, I mean, in China, they're talking about an ecological civilization now, which is quite a good thing. But it's all about China itself. So they've done a lot of replanting and they're moving quite rapidly into renewable energy, but they're also still building coal-fired power stations as well. And they are, I mean, when you look at the really big cities, they are running on very large dams, some of them. For instance, the Three Gorges Dam powers Chongqing and powers parts of Shanghai and so on. So that's all good stuff. But at the same time, when you look at these enormous global footprints of a country like China, particularly when it comes to animal feeds, then you are worried again and saying, okay, but I feel myself constantly in this sort of balance of, okay, here are the positive initiatives that are showing us where we could go in different directions globally. We are seeing all this stuff going on also in the context of COVID, for instance. I mean, everybody's suddenly growing vegetables again, which is great. I mean, a lot of friends of mine who for many years would just buy their vegetables in the supermarket, suddenly growing vegetables again. We have even got, set up on our own plot of land here, a few people who wanted allotment, say, okay, you can have a plot here on our few acres that we have and grow your vegetables. All great stuff. Just whether or not that can compete with the global picture of where we are still looking in very different directions, sadly.
Yeah, no, I sense that it's redesign, but not just on the supply side, but heavily on the demand side, in the sense of that we actually open up a conversation around quality of life and quality of human relationships and the importance of relationships more than nature, that leads to a redesign of how we live and what we want and our patterns, both in terms of diet and other forms of patterns of consumption. But I mean, you mentioned the pandemic. I'm wondering whether also that trend that seemed so unstoppable of more and more people moving into cities, like certainly in India and in a number of places where since the pandemic started, are beginning to see a reverse of that.
A bit of a reversal, yeah. The question that's a permanent reversal, or whether it's just a temporary response here, but yeah, that's certainly happening.
But in a world where periodic lockdowns into your apartment or immediate living space, no matter how small it might be for some less privileged families, is part of the new pattern that might happen more regularly. I'm wondering whether we're not going to see a new revival of smaller village and smaller town living, and also because through the pandemic the hesitation to let people work from home has disappeared, because so many employers had to do it now, and in the process they're beginning to realize that maybe they don't need to have such large offices and have everybody come in every morning, and the masses footprint of commuting might be reduced if people only go to the office 1 or 2 days a week, and work from home the rest of the time, or even with more people working much further away from the central office in small towns and villages. Yeah, maybe we're really seeing the beginning of a deeper transformation, because also with regard to soils, I don't know if you've seen this, but the European Union has just started a program where they're very much focusing on soil health as a central aim for the next 20 years.
Well, that's all good stuff. And I mean, it's interesting, the way where we live now partly resulted from what was happening in London in the 70s. At that time, we were faced with a very major economic crisis and a huge union, you know, sort of fights between trade unions and government and companies and so on, blackouts, and really, I mean, it was an extraordinary time. So there was hundreds of thousands of people at that time moved out of London, ended up moving to where we went to, small holdings, smaller towns, villages, into mid-Wales, into West Wales, into Herefordshire and so on. That was a major trend at the time, there's no doubt about it. I mean, even a lasting trend. I mean, a lot of people, when I speak to people around where we live in South Wales, a lot of people at one point lived in London, you know, or certainly in Bristol or in Birmingham or bigger cities. So, and I mean, certainly we are seeing new opportunities, as you already pointed out. I mean, there's no doubt that more people will be able to work more remotely than they were able to do before. Similarly, also global travel. I mean, I think people have realized that they can do Zoom conferences like we're doing right now, much more readily than they were used to in the past. So yeah, I mean, you know, when you look at the skies, you know, we are on the overhead route, or the route between Heathrow Airport and the United States, and there's far less airplanes flying overhead. Yeah. You know, 4 months, 6 months ago. So yeah, I think we're going to certainly see some major trend changes. I think you're right about some people in you know, India maybe having second thoughts about, you know, living in villages rather than living in Delhi or in Mumbai and so on. But obviously it's all about having an economic base, you know, and as long as cities are magnets for people who want a better life, like, you know, China, example of China demonstrates most vividly, then I think certainly it is not easy to persuade people suddenly to give up this mirage of urban living that has been so dominant in the last 30, 40 years. But yeah, I mean, it's certainly true that, you know, whenever you have a cataclysm of the kind that we have right now with COVID, it causes mind changes, it causes consciousness changes, and is to some extent going to have result in different outcomes than we would have expected 4 or 5 months ago.
So if you were given, on the basis of your amazing track record and membership of both World Future Council and the Club of Rome, if you were given the opportunity to advise government leaders on how to respond to the pandemic and how to spend the money that they're now spending anyway in order to restart economies everywhere, where would you put the effort? What do you think is the main place to really pay attention to? Education, food, urbanization, a bit of all of it?
Well, I don't know whether you saw it, but I sort of published a sort of post-COVID manifesto. Did you see that?
I did. Of course, I wanted to mention that. Tell a little bit more about it, because I actually...
Well, I mean, basically, it's just a checklist of where we need to go. I mean, I did in 2003, I did something called Earth Emergency Call to Action, which at that time that was for the Johannesburg summit, UN summit on sustainability. And at that time, it was already becoming apparent that we are on a kind of global crisis situation. So basically, I took that document and brought it up to date a little bit more. I'm saying basically, you know, it's all about changes in direction in every possible way. And I mean, I've kind of done a new version of that for the Club of Rome, which is specifically on economics and reframing economics. So basically, it's obviously all about circular systems. It's about understanding, you know, better understanding the global impacts that we have and acting on those. And I certainly think, you know, that this kind of thinking is there in many people's heads these days, but there's a fundamental difference between realization and actual action to change. And I think certainly it's above all else the financial systems, I mean, the willingness of governments to take control of economies is not really there at this moment in time. I mean, it goes back to the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union, when basically the world's governments were forced to implement globalization because companies wanted that, and particularly financial institutions. So it's really about power systems on the planet. As long as we don't get to grips with the fact that financial systems demand more growth regardless of the consequences, that governments always kowtowing at this stage to the whims of companies and their globalization impacts or intentions. You know, ultimately, the power systems that dominate what we do at the time, unless they change fundamentally, we're not going to get the change in direction that we need. I mean, we are seeing the incredible dominance of a few huge companies now, you know, really running the planet, whether it's oil companies, whether it's global trading companies, Amazon being a prime example. And we are seeing their demands controlling what we do. And until we get back to really democracy in the real sense of the word, asserting itself with the added factor of young people saying, okay, it's not just a decision making for the next few years, but for decision making for the next few centuries that have to be brought into the decision making process, we're not going to get the change of direction.
I mean, there seem to be like, I'd love to be play mouse in a conversation like that. I was just thinking within the Club of Rome, you have Kate Raworth's wonderful work on donut economics. Then you have John Fullerton, who joined bringing in regenerative capitalism. Then for quite some time, Bob Costanza has been part of the club with much more kind of quantify the worth of nature approach. It has its own pitfalls in it. And some of them are involved in this We All Alliance.
Yeah, that's right.
And where do you, because of course, if we don't, like from a systems perspective, structure drives behavior. And we, like even those companies that aren't part of the ones you just mentioned, but the smaller but still very large ones that really do want to change, are finding themselves hitting a glass ceiling of what they can actually do because the playing field is thus rigged against regenerative practice. It incentivizes degeneration and the externalization of social and ecological damage, and therefore, if we don't do this redesign, we won't. It'd be silly to expect a different outcome. But do you really think that they're moving towards some form of consensus of how we could, at least in theory and later then also in practice, create a system that is regenerative by design in terms of the economic system? Because what right now seems to be the case is that on the one hand, the people say it's impossible to be regenerative in a capitalist system. Actually, there is something about the ownership of the means of production and the ownership of land that is fundamentally structured in such a way that it creates this pyramid scheme. And then are others who are more in a sort of strategic way saying, well, let's create regenerative capitalism because they want to keep the arch capitalists and the current dogma on board. And I I can see that there's wisdom in both approaches, like trying to redesign capitalism to the point that what we end up with isn't capitalism anymore, but use the language of redesigning capitalism in order to keep people on board in the conversation about transformation. Where do you stand there? Do you think we can save capitalism, or is it structurally dysfunctional?
Well, it's not going to go away. That's the reality of it. I mean, all the revolutions that we've had in the past have tried to get rid of capital. Well, not all of them. I mean, there's always been the uprising of the workers, the public against the power of the few. This has happened throughout history. But sadly, those people who had the reins of power in their hand so far have still always won. I mean, look at the communist revolution in China or in Russia. I mean, basically, in the end, both of them are now state capital or capitalism has researched in both of those large entities, those huge countries, sadly. And the reality is that, I mean, it's interesting to look at the history of socialism. And Karl Marx, for instance, was very interested in the metabolism concept, and realized that the concentration of power by a few industrialists and money men, if you like, ultimately led to these conflicts between humans and nature. So he argued that we needed to understand the relationship between society and nature in new ways, and he referred to that in the context of the metabolism of societies.
Yeah.
But in the end, we are seeing now, that the dominance of existing power structures have not been broken. And so, I mean, it is great to conceptualize new economics, donut economics, human-faced economic, well-being economics as is being done by many different people. But we don't have the reins of power in our hands. So, I mean, the real hope that I have is that the pressure of young people, kids telling their parents around the dinner table that they cannot accept that they will have to live in a world which is totally, where that, the indebtedness of young people as a result of externalities not being internalized in the price of products and so on, is a given. So I think, the realization that we are on hiding to nothing with modern civilization in relationship to what we're doing to nature, that I think is the greatest hope that we now have. Mm. I really think that the fact that young people are raising their voices so vividly and so clearly and so loudly is where we can really put our put our hope more than anything else. So I think it's great to have alternative economists coming up with concepts of the kind that we've already talked about, but ultimately, unless there's a social pressure for that change to take place, then we are not going to get very far. I mean, the socialist revolutions were driven by workers and intellectuals, but the social movement today has not really had any really major sort of power to generate change, because there was no clear force for change that was visible. Whereas I think today, with young people saying, enough is enough, we cannot accept that we don't have a future. That, to my mind, is the greatest power that we can hope can really generate change in the world.
And where do you sit, last question, with regard to that the transformation we're talking about and still hoping for in the context of contrary evidence, and then the hope of young generations maybe finally tipping the balance towards real transformational change. I personally, and I'm just wanting to check against your decades of experience, the re-regionalization, you mentioned Marx, like Kropotkin's mystical anarchism.
Yeah, sure.
Basically an anarchism that isn't what we now understand of anarchism, which is there's no rule.
Yeah, sure.
It is a radical subsidiarity that is coupled with a level of education and understanding of the radical interbeing of life, that would then make people, without the need for supernatural national structures of top down, where both national government and international governance become subsidiary to the enablement of people in place meeting their needs and also making decisions about how needs are met in their place, but in global solidarity. That, for me, this nested structure of refitting ourselves into life's nested processes, where the local, the regional, and the global are fundamentally interconnected and interdependent, is part of the pathway. Like really re-inhabiting our regions, re-inhabiting
Sure. Well, that's certainly something that, I mean, working with John Seymour all those years ago, of course, that was our main issue and our main concern, you know, local regional self-sufficiency, self-reliance, and so on. But we still have a long way to go with that. I mean, just yesterday I was watching a TV program on the BBC, Countryfied it's called, and it showed how crops are currently harvested. And this, in this particular incident, it was grass, you know, silage. And you saw these vast tractors that could cut, they had a mower on each side and one at the front. They could cut 12-meter widths of grass, right? And then they had these incredible machines putting it all into trailers and then ultimately into big plastic bags where the silage was being kept. I'm saying all this is because I've been working a lot on the concept of what I call the amplified man. We are so amplified by technology today that, for instance, when it comes to farming, you know, a village where I live today used to grow, in fact, historically grew out of the local countryside. It became possible for that village to exist because the people in the village had the farmland around the village available to grow their crops and then to develop their nice local lifestyles. Today, villages in Europe are completely detached from the local countryside because farming and the village life haven't got any direct connections any longer. So until you get to the point where people basically say, okay, we will reconnect the lifestyle of the region to the land, even in terms of how people participate in food production and so on, then I think we are still, you know, living in a sort of illusion. I mean, basically, you know, in the past, you know, 20-30% of people used to farm the land. In Britain today, in Europe today, it's about less than 1% of people. Everybody who farms the land sits in a huge tractor, has huge machinery available to them to basically, you know, farm 300, 400, 500 acres. And I mean, when you look at that in the Amazon and in some places where today animal feeds are produced, you know, one farmer can farm 5,000 acres, you know, with these enormous machines. So we have a problem in terms of how we are so amplified by technology that we are not able to simply say, okay, let's go back to re-localisation of the kind that Helena Norberg-Hodge and others have been talking about for so long. The reality is this contradiction between who we've become as human beings, amplified through technology, and how we can get back to a way of life that relates closely to the local countryside, you know. So what I'm saying is it's great to have this concept of relocalization. And I'm very much part of that movement. And I grow my own vegetables and I live, you know, we get firewood from the forest, and we have a close-knit community in our village. We do festivals. So that kind of stuff is beginning to happen again. I mean, the village carnivals, village festivals, village sharing of experiences, village community life in various ways. But when it comes to the actual economic life of regions, it's still so totally dominated by the opportunities inherent in modern technology that there's this disconnect between a local community and its surrounding countryside. And that, I think, until we get to grips with that, it's going to be hard to make relocalization of the kind that you talk about a true reality.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I mean, we could have schedule a call to just talk about the role of technology. That would be fascinating because I'm Like Bucky Fuller's famous quote, if you want to change the way people think, don't tell them what to think, give them a tool, the use of which will change the way they think.
Okay, that's a nice quote, yeah.
I've used that quote a number of times in a number of settings, but only in the last few months have I realized that if you apply that quote to any technology, from the printing press to the computers we're currently using to have this conversation, to everything we use, it begins to really unpack how insidious technology actually pervades in all our lives and has affected how we think about how to create solutions, how to meet needs, how to relate to people, how to relate to the world. And I'm not saying that it's all negative, but we seem to not be able to step back enough to really have an ethical conversation about what technologies to use when and how, and particularly the systemic understanding of the side effects of. It seemed like a good idea at the time to have a tractor that can take people away from the hard work of walking behind a animal that was pulling a basic plow, but we don't think of all the side effects that come with the use of these technologies, but that's,
you know, when my wife and I moved to our cottage 44 years ago, and we bought a little tractor in order to farm, you know, make hay and all the rest of it, plow some fields and so on. That was a 20 horsepower tractor, and in those days that was, you know, a small tractor at the time, but typically that time you had 40 horsepower tractors as the norm. Today 200, 300 horsepower is the norm.
Yeah.
And that means far less people working the land even than they did 40 years ago. Mm. So re-localisation is a wonderful concept, and I mean, I really, you know, admire the vigor in which this is being pursued by so many people, including yourself. And I've written about it, and I've, you know, our way of life is much more local than it would have been while we were living in London all those years ago. But certainly aspects of local life are reviving very actively, no doubt about it. But by and large, unless we get to grips with the economics of it as well, mm-hmm. the culture to fit the bill in the way that we would like to.
Well, I think we've had a wonderful, wide-ranging conversation. Really appreciate your time and love to do this again.
Well, it's great to be in touch. And what are you doing now in Mallorca? You told me that you were trying to do a sort of Adelaide type of initiative there. Is that happening, or?
Yeah, I mean, what I've learned with working at that system scale of a whole island and a small city is that you can't push it, but you have to be there when the opportunity arises. And I sense that 10 years of conversations and relationships buildings are starting to converge. Just tomorrow, I'm having a conversation with a local friend who's put forward a proposal called Baleares Verde, which is to plant 1 million trees across different places on Mallorca in agroforestry productive systems to learn how to farm in the future as climate change unfolds here in the Mediterranean, and link that in with Willem Verweer's wonderful 4 returns approach that he developed with the Common Land Foundation and local landowners around the island. And that will begin the conversation around what does bioregional regeneration at island scale look like. We have this wonderful opportunity to do it both marine regeneration with the sea between the islands and terrestrial regeneration. And of course, the opportunity and the crisis that we're now in with the major local economy having collapsed and people not quite willing yet to admit to what extent it has collapsed semi-permanently or will not bounce back to the unsustainable and
level before,
levels that it was before. I think Mallorca's in for 3-4 really difficult years where they have to let go of previous givens and assumptions that will never change. But in that, I see a huge potential for people being open to rethink the future and rethink the whole island and the islands as potential models for exactly the kind of conversations that that we were just having. Like, how do we create alternative models of re-regionalization, and to what extent, and what is actually possible? And islands are great examples of bioregional.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
what about renewables? I mean, are you getting, is Mallorca getting serious about powering itself renewably?
Finally, there's been a little bit of a shift just in the last few months as part of the COVID response. They've flagged up that they will agree 50 new solar parks around the island.
Oh, really? Okay. What about wind?
Wind has always been an issue because of the local bird watching organization is also very strongly involved in protecting the environment in general, and they have bought into this unfounded belief that windmills kind of are bad for bird life. I mean, the reality.
What about offshore wind?
It's so far not in conversation.
Because I don't know how deep the sea is, but there are now these floating turbines.
There's plenty of opportunities for renewables around the Balearics. To my mind, it would have to be a really diverse and more, rather than creating large wind farms, create decentralized, diverse systems of both solar thermal. Spain has the highest, one of the best solar thermal power plant companies in the world. Is from Sevilla in southern Spain. So we could use concentrated solar thermal to replace some of the power plants we've got. So the short answer is, I still have you in the back of my mind. I would love to, when the conditions are right here, to suggest that you and Barbara come down for some time on Mallorca, and you can be a thinker of residents and share the Adelaide examples and all your wisdom. We'll see if I can make it happen.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Well, have a great day.
And say hello to your wife, and thank you so much for...
And to your family as well.
Okay, bye-bye.